You know, for much of modern history, the fight for justice seemed to be about one simple thing: equality, right? But what if being treated the exact same isn't always fair? In the late 20th century, a brand new demand completely changed politics. I mean, forever. People weren't just asking for equality rights anymore, but for the recognition of their differences. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack this really powerful and, yeah, controversial idea and see how it totally reshaped our understanding of who gets to belong. So, to really get to the heart of this, let's just start with a question. I want you to imagine for a second that your sense of who you are, your very identity, wasn't just shaped by you, but by how everyone else sees you. Now, what if the picture that society reflected back at you is demeaning? Or even worse, what if it didn't see you at all? This is the core harm that a whole new kind of politics set out to fix. Okay, so how does a harm like that even become a political issue? Well, to get it, we first have to remember that our ideas about justice, they aren't set in stone. Not at all. They evolve. You know, the political theorist William E. Connolly had a great way of putting it. He said that new claims to identity can basically force their way onto what he called the register of justice, from a place where before they were totally invisible. And all of a sudden, forms of exclusion that were just accepted as normal, bam, they're exposed as these deep, profound injustices. And that demands a whole new way of thinking. And this new focus made it super clear that oppression isn't just about not having rights or money. It can take a whole bunch of forms. I mean, sure, you can be excluded from citizenship, that's the obvious one. But you can also face what's called sociocultural exclusion, which is basically systemic disrespect. And, believe it or not, you can even be excluded from the history of political ideas itself. That's what's known as canonical exclusion. All right, so this brings us to a really huge transformation, a major turning point that started around the 1970s, and it's what we often call the shift to the politics of identity. See, for a long time, big political movements, think something like Marxism, they were all about universalism. The main problem was class, right? And the goal was economic equality for everyone, based on our shared humanity. But this new politics of difference, a term from Iris Marion Young, it totally flipped the script. The focus shifted to identity. The goal wasn't to pretend differences don't exist, but to actually have the unique identity of a group valued and integrated into the rest of society. And this gets to a really crucial point about just how unique this kind of harm is. The thinker James Tully explains it perfectly. The injustice isn't just about inequality in the traditional sense. It's about having your identity misrecognized or not recognized at all. It's about having some alien identity, some demeaning false picture of who you are forced on you from the outside. So the central concept that came up to describe the solution to this kind of harm was recognition. And this is an idea most famously explored by the philosopher Charles Taylor.
Okay, so what does it actually mean to demand recognition? Let's break it down.
So at its very heart, recognition is based on what Taylor called his social thesis. And it's a pretty simple but profound idea. Our identities are not formed in a vacuum. We actually build them in dialogue with other people. Who we are is shaped in a huge way by whether society sees us and whether it sees us accurately. And believe me, the stakes here are incredibly high. Taylor's argument is that misrecognition isn't just about, hurt feelings. He says it causes real damage, real distortion. If you're constantly being shown a demeaning picture of yourself by the world around you, that can become its own form of oppression. Now, what's really interesting here is how Taylor uses this idea to critique traditional liberalism. He said that a system based on just applying the same neutral rules to everybody, he called it procedural liberalism, well, it just can't handle this problem. And why not? Because it's deeply suspicious of collective goals. Things like, say, the survival of a minority culture, which might actually require treating that group differently to help it survive. So, as you can probably imagine, this whole idea was, hugely controversial. And that leads us right into a major debate. The critiques against the politics of recognition pretty much fall into two big camps. On one side, you've got the liberal critique, which is all about universal rights. And on the other side, you have the egalitarian critique, which is focused on economic redistribution. So, let's take the first one. Thinkers like Brian Barry, for example, argued that the government should be completely difference blind. The number one priority should be making sure every single individual has the exact same rights, period. From this point of view, focusing on group identity actually undermines that core principle of moral equality. Then you have the other side, with figures like Richard Rorty, and they were worried that this whole politics of difference was a really dangerous distraction. For them, All this focus on cultural recognition was just pulling energy and attention away from the real fight, the universal goal of fighting poverty and economic inequality. But is it really an either-or choice? Well, Nancy Fraser argued absolutely not. She came up with a way to kind of bridge this divide. She pointed out that, look, most oppression involves both things, cultural disrespect or misrecognition and economic injustice. So the goal shouldn't be to pick one. The goal should be what she calls participatory parity. And that just means the ability for everyone to participate as a full peer in society without being held back by barriers of either culture or class. Okay, so we've seen the big theory and the big critiques, but how does this stuff actually play out? Let's make it way more concrete and take a look at a specific example: gender. So, a totally foundational concept for feminist thinkers was this key distinction between sex and gender. Pretty simple. Sex refers to biology, but gender, that refers to the social and cultural roles and identities that we build on top of that biology. And this was a revolutionary idea. Why? Because it allowed feminists to argue that the subordinate role of women in society wasn't natural at all. It was socially constructed. And if it's constructed, well, that means it can be changed. Now, hey, remember that idea we mentioned at the beginning? Canonical exclusion? Well, this is where it comes roaring back in a really powerful way. Feminist scholars basically argued that the entire history of Western political thought was a textbook example of this very thing. I mean, for example, you had Susan Oken, who showed how for generations scholars just pretended not to see the biased and often straight-up misogynistic things that the great philosophers wrote about women. And then there's Carol Pateman, who made this really radical claim that the famous social contract, the supposed basis of modern society, was secretly built on top of a sexual contract that systematically pushed women out of public life. But maybe the most famous and powerful articulation of this exact kind of misrecognition came from Simone de Beauvoir. Her argument was that throughout Western culture, man has always been defined as the defaults, the norm, while woman, she's been defined simply as his other. And just listen to how powerfully she puts this. She wrote, "Man represents both the positive and the neutral, whereas woman represents only the negative." Wow. I mean, that is the ultimate expression of misrecognition, right? It's where one group isn't just seen as different, but as a deviation from the human standard itself. And all of this leaves us with a really critical question, one that's still right at the heart of these debates today. The politics of recognition, it aims to empower excluded groups by valuing their unique identities. But in doing that, does it also risk cementing those identities? Does it risk putting people into fixed, unchanging boxes? It's a fundamental tension, and it's one we are absolutely still grappling with.